Namaste, everyone. This is Vidal, Maheshananda, and welcome to the Satsanga podcast, where we explore different topics related to yoga, Vedanta, Ayurveda, Jyotish, or also known as Vedic astrology, and we reflect on the deeper wisdom traditions that are derived from the great and vast culture that is in Renaissance in India today. So today's topic will focus on spiritual resilience and sensitivity. These two principles are cornerstones of the Vedantic mindset. In Sanskrit, they're referred to as vairagya, and another aspect of this mindset is known as viveka, or discernment, or discrimination. And both of these require concentration, a focused mind, a mind that has overcome distractions or disturbances, what I often refer to as a cloudy mind, and devotion. Devotion cultivates a sensitivity, an opening of the heart. It's an interesting paradox to be detached, but at the same time also express compassion and be engaged in our daily activities. These two seem to be a very important in the tradition as teachings, but to apply these in practice in our life, they're almost opposites in a way. They feel completely in contradiction to each other. And so I wanted to dedicate this satsanga to understanding how these two actually work together. And they provide a perfect balance on the spiritual path, on the path as a yogi, and for anyone moving towards a spiritual or evolutionary life. So there are many modern views. And when we look at them and compare them to these principles of having resilience and sensitivity, which are opposites. Again, remember, resilience relates to being tough, to overcoming, to being a spiritual warrior, to rising to the challenge. And sensitivity is not defined as being weak or sensitive in the sense of that you can be beaten or that you are too gentle. Quite the opposite. So when we define spiritual resilience as vairagya, it's very difficult to find English terms or equivalents to such a profound concept and principle that is taught in Vedanta, such as vairagya. You often see the word dispassion correlated to vairagya. And again, this doesn't mean be bored and live a boring life, or someone who doesn't have enthusiasm for life and for their purpose. But the term vairagya reflects more of a detachment, a neutrality of the mind, whether good things occur or whether bad things occur. There is a type of detachment or reflective quality or power that the mind has to be able to do that. In fact, those that practice vairagya have more compassion and more concern for the world and for others that are going through challenges than those that are reacting to bad news. Oh, I'm so sorry that this happened to you. I know you must be overwhelmed. And it's not to say that responding to the call of a brother or sister that is in need or being challenged, but using an inner sense of love and compassion that comes from the inner side, that we can give through prayer, through understanding, through patience, and non-reactivity, non-reaction to the dramatic event in that person's life, but a responding. So we have to differentiate reacting from responding. So modern views are often very critical towards this type of mental attitude that gives us this resilience for the world, and it prepares us. And often people are criticized as being insensitive. How can you not care? How can you not do more for us? How can you have this attitude about such a person that is so distant? While many of these views that are so critical often engage in an insensitivity themselves. When we get into the act of reacting or criticizing these so-called insensitivities, or often a person who's considered selfish because they focus so much time on themselves, and when we use this idea of focusing on themselves, it's we're coming to the point of a person who's focused on spiritual development, who's actually giving more time to understanding themselves and observing the world rather than over chattering within the world and trying to be correct or appropriate to the outer world. We see this a lot with being politically correct. When this type of behavior occurs, as we see today in our outer world, in our social networks, and between one another, this is a divide. that is occurring because of a lack of ahimsa. We are engaging in a form of violence, a psychological violence that divides us, that gives power to the ego. And this is why ahimsa, nonviolence, is not merely avoiding violent actions, but it is more importantly having a compassionate attitude that is founded in this principle of being spiritually resilient. Yogic devotion or bhakti is superficially normally defined as chanting, mantras, dancing, and practices related to a worshiping of the divine in various forms, often correlated to Krishna or Vishnu, and many other aspects of devotion exist in many of the different lines or lineages. But devotion is not merely the act of mantra or singing or displaying this love. It is the externalization of devotion that basically feeds the senses. It becomes like a sensory bath. I am dancing. I am chanting. I am feeling intoxicated. One must ask, who is feeling? And truly discern and distinguish what is actually occurring. So, real sensitivity in the bhakti tradition reflects an inner sensitivity of the mind and heart. In that, the mind has transcended sensory desire or appeal. And essentially, the mind dissolves into the heart to the point that one feels compassion for all living things. When this idea of the mind, ego, senses, intellect, all of these forms of the mind, because it has these various aspects or branches, the mind. It's not just this entity. When the mind dissolves into the heart, we remove identification. We remove externalization. And the heart, or feeling, or sensitivity, is an attunement, a finer level of connecting with the divine, of becoming aware and growing in our awareness of the all-pervasive power and presence of the divine consciousness. You know, Yogananda was once asked a simple question, and a devotee says, Gurudev, God seems vague and far away. Yogananda replies, the Lord seems distant only because your attention is directed outward to his creation and not inward to him. And I want to bring up a point here. When he says the Lord seems distant only because your attention is directed outward toward his creation, so he's recognizing that creation is God and not inward towards him. Goes on to say, whenever your mind wanders in the maze of myriad worldly thoughts, patiently lead it back to remembrance of the indwelling Lord. So I want to reflect on this second point. He says, whenever your mind wanders in the maze of the myriad worldly thoughts. So he is not criticizing or saying that the divine doesn't exist in creation, but he is specifically pointing out that whenever the mind wanders in this maze of myriad worldly thoughts, right? So he's saying that when the mind gets tangled up in the realm of thoughts, the divine, the Lord, seems very distant. We won't find God in those entanglements of thoughts because we're thinking about so many things. Worries and experiences, the senses are constantly throwing different influences that are pushing out different clouds of thoughts in the mind. He says, patiently lead it back to remembrance of the indwelling Lord, that the divine consciousness, essence, exists within you, within every one of us. In time, you will find him ever with you. A God who talks with you in your own language. A God whose face peeps at you from every flower and shrub and blade of grass. So he says that by bringing the mind back to remembrance of that indwelling presence within you, that divine presence, indwelling Lord, saying God is within you. In time, you will find him ever with you, that consciousness is always with you. If you practice the presence and recognize that God never leaves you, he is always with you, regardless of where you go and what you do and who you're with. It all depends on where the mind goes. When you can recognize that presence, then, right, within that indwelling presence within you, then Yogananda goes back to say, a God whose face peeps at you from every flower and shrub and blade of grass. So when you recognize that you are divine, then outwardly you begin to see that same divinity in nature, in everything around you. It is there and everywhere. All living things includes the natural world, its beautiful creatures, and these great elements, earth, water, fire, air, and ether. And so the real bhakti that cultivates that sensitivity cultivates the capacity that the mind, through the heart, can feel and become aware of that divine presence. So the plants sing when you cultivate this inner connection. You begin to recognize the rocks sing. The animals speak, although because their language relies on an innate intelligence that the dull human mind cannot comprehend, we have reduced them, meaning animals, to being dumb or lower than humans. Remember, they follow instinct. They always follow their intelligence, their capacity is seen in their behavior and their patterning. It is like a clock. It is like a formula that never fails. But humans, having an intuitive capacity that we need to develop, otherwise we can lose it, can reduce ourselves to this instinctual level. And we become almost confused. Because we're living in a human body, we have the power to reason and intuit things, but yet we behave in such a contradictory way. And this is why we see so much violence in the world. Violence is never a solution to any problem. Violence never leads to love. So I want to share with you a story from a great sage, great Swami Purushottamananda. Swami Purushottamananda was a direct disciple of Swami Brahmananda, who was one of the great disciples, direct disciples of Ramakrishna Paramahansa. And Swami Purushottamananda lived in a cave in the state of Uttarakhand. I have visited this cave. It is a well-known cave. It is known as Vashishta Guha or Vashishta Gufa. Guha meaning cave in Hindi. And he lived in this cave for almost 40 years. And remarkably, he sustained himself, he slept with the minimal things on a very hard surface. And the cave is profound. It has a history. It goes back almost 1,000 years to another great scholar, say, to the actual Vashishta that was there, who wrote many great commentaries on scriptures. I don't believe this is the same Vashishta, the guru of Rama. It wouldn't make sense because Rama, the great king and yogi, lived thousands and thousands of years ago, even predates Lord Bhagwan Krishna. And this is another Vashishta. And so Swami Purushottamananda lived in this cave. And I want to paraphrase a story that Swami Shivananda Radha, known as, who was a disciple of the great Swami Shivananda. She was a guru bhai of my Vedanta guru, Swami Jyotirmayananda. Although Swami Radha was not there very long, she did train and took sannyas, renunciation, under the great Shivananda. And she visited Swami Purushottamananda, and she noticed that he was particular about cleanliness and tidiness in all areas, but especially in front of the cave, that was always swept and very, very clean. In fact, every time a leaf would fall from a tree, she said that he would point it out to his students, who had to pick it up and clean it up right away. So then she thought, my gosh, is he kind of one of these individuals who's just a stickler about meaningless things, like too many leaves, or not having everything so fixed? But she noticed, she realized that Purushottamananda was not acting just like a fussy housewife or somebody who's so fixed around the way they want things that they can't enjoy their home or their belongings. But Purushottamananda explained that without cleanliness and tidiness in one's immediate surroundings and in their home, one cannot invite the Lord in. As is once said, cleanliness is next to godliness. And he illustrated a beautiful story of Lord Krishna and a devotee. The devotee had observed all the rules and regulations and had advancedly and sufficiently submerged his mind in deep and divine thoughts, using Lord Krishna as his Ishta Devata, as his focal point, as his devotion, the door of devotion. And finally, the devotee complained to the Lord. He said, Krishna, daily I spend many hours coming to you. Have mercy on me, and please at least come to me just once. So the Lord granted his devotee his sincere wish, and Krishna gave him a particular time when he would come. So the devotee then began to do a very thorough cleaning of the house and everything in it, opening all the doors and the windows, getting fresh air and prana inside, and throwing out anything he didn't need. Then, when he had everything shiny and clean, ready for Krishna, he awaited the coming of Krishna. But when the appointed time had passed, without Krishna appearing, the devotee wept all night, so sad. How could you forget? How could you break our promise, Krishna? He was shattered. Then, suddenly, the devotee became aware of a very powerful presence. A radiance came into his space, into his home, into his heart. And Krishna said, I couldn't enter your house for all the garbage that you piled outside. It was blocking him from being able to enter the house. So there's a metaphor to this. And Purushottamananda explains that the doors and windows, when the devotee had opened all the doors and windows, These are symbolic of the organs of sense perception. And while the body and the mind need to be purified within, life in the world outside cannot be littered with the garbage of our selfish actions. We have to be aware. We have to recognize that God is both within and without. And our inner house must be clean, and our outer house, and our love and our sensitivity for nature must be pure and connected and direct. This balance between being resilient and sensitive is the essence of Vedantic wisdom, as expressed in many of the great scriptures. When you read the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, or even the great Yoga Vasishtha, in fact, in the first chapter of the Yoga Vasishtha, it begins with Rama's great vairagya, this great dispassion that he's feeling, a distaste, an aversion for the outer world and the world process. And this is a mark. This is a very important bridge that the devotee has to cross. When one feels this distaste for the outer world and the world process, the aspirant begins to recognize that the world cannot bring eternal satisfaction. That happiness cannot be attained by things and more things and people and places. The world process is commonly seen in the swing of raga and dvesha. These are two of what the great sage Patanjali explains are afflictions of the mind, the kleshas of the mind. And raga and dvesha are, like I often say, a yo-yo, an up and down, the swinging of the mind. When things are good, we're ecstatic. When the things are down, we're depressed. And it's this ride of up and down, that leads to nowhere. We're attracted to something, someone, and then suddenly, after we taste it, we're pushing it away. Notice the pattern that all humans have with the world in this way. We have to love Vedanta because it says, get up and fight the battle of life so that you cultivate willpower or God's power. This idea of being a spiritual warrior, as I mentioned earlier in the satsang, is about constantly cultivating the power of will. The recognition that you alone cannot succeed. You must recognize that there is a divine presence within you, within yourself. as you recognize that divine presence within yourself more and more, and doing it consistently. That continuity of practice brings you what we had spoke about earlier, that Yogananda said, in time you will find him ever with you. But you have to keep that remembrance of the indwelling presence of the divine. And there are many ways to do this. Keeping divine company, having divine reminders, images, reading spiritual books or books of higher knowledge before you go to sleep, meditation, and an integral yoga practice overall will keep training the mind to be less reactive, to not being trapped in the yo-yo of raga and dvesha, up and down, up and down. Things are good, things are bad. But rather a freedom. This being a spiritual warrior gives us freedom. But we must become anchored in the divine consciousness. In the Ramayana, there's an episode in which Lord Rama, very famously, was confronted by Ravana, the demonic force. And this Ravana is basically the incarnation and of all that is evil, all that is negative and bad in the world, right? And at the time, Ravana began to brag to Ram about his glory and his power and his greatness, threatening him, saying that he would destroy Rama and his entire monkey army, to do many, many terrible things. So, in response, Rama says, look, there are basically three types of people. One type goes on bragging and saying a great deal and doesn't do anything about it. Just a bunch of talk. Such a person is like a poinciana tree, showing lots of flowers, but not a single fruit that you can taste with delight. And then there's a second type of personality that says a lot and does a lot as well. And we know there are people like this. Usually a person that is saying a lot is saying that because they're thinking a lot about that. The thought produces the words, and eventually the words produce the actions. Such a person that performs actions and delivers fruits, you could say, is like a mango tree or another type of fruit tree that produces those wonderful fruits. But there's a third type that doesn't say much, the one that remains silent and just does what he has to do. Because that person knows. It is law. It is my dharma. I must do this. And then, so such a person, this type of person, who silently performs without display, without grandiosity, without announcement, develops the fruits, the benefits, the good fruits of these karmic actions, without your ever seeing a single flower. So having integrity is essential to this path, or this balance of spiritual resilience and sensitivity. We have to develop a personality that has integrity, that implies and is focused more on action and less on words, which becomes more powerful, more impactful, and less sensitive in the external sense, or the word sentimental. Sentimentality and superficiality or hypersensitivity in the external sense dies. It leads to nowhere. These are the people that say things and never do things. So we must look at doing things with great integrity. This happens, we see this a lot in relationships. A person may say to a friend, to a family member, I will help you all the time, I'll be there for you. I love you forever and forever. I will never leave you. You're my baby. How many movies have we watched? How many dramas? And how many times have even each of us said this to another? The rock songs repeated over and over again. Baby, baby, baby. I love you forever and ever. I cannot live without you. So when a relationship or an action is governed merely by this shallowness, this sentimentality of just words, as one of my great counselors, Paramananda, said, talk is cheap. It cannot be sustained. Relationships that are based on these levels don't last. There is lots and lots of enthusiasm. We see this in the beginning. We're going to do this together. We're going to be a team. And there's all this excitement. But as time passes, the mind swings like a yo-yo from total attraction, raga, to total aversion, get away. I don't want this. It doesn't work for me. I don't need it anymore. What do you mean? Just a week ago, a month ago, we were in love. So most people would like to be people of integrity. Most of us want to be able to say that I have integrity, that I have healthy relationships, healthy personalities. But this integrity needs to be integrated psychologically, physically, and spiritually. But few have any training, and few make a regular effort to develop this integrity. This art of integrity that can give us the great balance of being resilient to the world, unshaken by this world, and sensitive, attuned to the inner divine presence. And we feel that presence, we recognize that presence wherever we go, whatever we are doing. And equally, and interesting enough, I want to go back to Purushottamananda, the cave yogi, once shared with Radha, and he says, come into the cave. I want you to come in and meditate in the cave. And she meditated inside this cave. It's dark, and there's a long sort of hallway. You can't literally stand in this hallway, but it is long, and it is a corridor, and then you get to a larger space towards the end of the cave where you can sit. And the darkness is just profound. She meditated in there, and she began to hear songs. She began to hear birds singing. And she couldn't understand it because she thought that she was so deeply inside this cave that these songs, these wonderful sounds that she was hearing sounded very real, very alive. When she came outside of the cave, she said to Purushottamananda, I heard birds singing in there. Purushottamananda said, it is not only the birds that sing, but rocks also sing. Everything in nature has a vibration. Everything has a great energy. You just have to become aware. This is the purpose of this practice. And to summarize the entirety of this teaching, it is about cultivating this greater awareness that the divine is within. The divine is also outside of us, in, as Yogananda said, his creation. But we must first discover it and cultivate that divine presence, anchor ourselves with him within ourselves. And then the beauty, the luster, the gifts of the divine come like a synchronized watch. Everything comes at its appropriate time, just as it's meant to be. This person introduces us to another person. This experience leads us to the next place. So I often hear people chattering about political issues. And I tell them, the same issues that you've been complaining about, thousands and millions of others are also complaining about these issues in other countries. Perhaps hundreds of them. And in other cultures and empires and kingdoms, over and over and over again. My king doesn't do this for us. He doesn't provide this for us. How can you vote? How can you support a king like that? I say, shut up. Practice silence. Cultivate that integrity. And if it's so important for you, do something about it. Don't just talk about it. Perform. And produce those fruits as a result of your actions. And take a higher stance. Or choose to be silent about it. Choose to just do what you know is your higher calling. And you do it because it's important for you and you don't need to tell anybody about it. And you take that higher stance. Because these outer issues are always there. Whether they be educational issues, racial issues, unless we do something deeply that aligns with our higher purpose, our dharma, we give these things power. We give these things more attention. We must anchor, everyone. Throw the anchor of your consciousness into the divine consciousness. So that the seas of trouble, the waves of despair, will give you great resilience to all the petty occurrences of the outer world, of death, disease, divorce, loss, war, crimes, etc., on and on and on. It's crazy to depend on these things. It's crazy to try and fix these things. It's endless. And it's crazy to think that these things will end from an external perspective until we anchor again in that divine consciousness. So these great principles can come alive in your life today. And even though they may seem in contrast or opposite to each other, we can find their essence, their potentiality, by increasing our integrity and following our divine purpose, our dharma, by good association, satsanga, and not giving more up and down to the yo-yo of the mind. And we stabilize that mind. We focus that mind. We slow the mind. And this is where Ayurveda helps so much. This was why it brings balance to the yogic and Vedantic mindset. It brings the seasons and the rituals and the self-care practices to balance the mind and body. And so there you have it. And I wish you all great fortune and many blessings. Namaste, and my sincere pranams to all of you as you integrate these great wisdom principles into your life. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Jai Shri Krishna Govinda Hare Murare Hey Nata Narayana Vasudeva. Namaste.